Digital 410 proudly presents the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast with your hosts Don Abernathy, Jeff Copsetta, and Henry Sledge.
Me, I'm John Wayne. The costume department set me up with these great navy whites. What do you think?
I'm trying to watch this.
I've seen this movie 13 times, okay?
Well, I haven't, so shut up.
Watch the movie, it's fine.
Wait, favorite part.
Got that, Benny? Got that, Benny?
Thanks anyway.
Got that, Benny?
Cut a penny?
What?
Last time I made a jump was in Holland. No, wait a minute.
I mean, you haven't jumped since you got out?
No. We have to make a jump once every 3 months to keep your jump status up.
Okay.
So just before I came home, I made a jump. Well, I went down to the Jump Fest the other day.
Yeah?
And I don't like their chutes. You know, they give you this. The chutes that we had, you had going up and you pull on a tool, you go right, or you pull on the left.
Yeah.
And you were able to control your chute
Yeah.
a lot better than that.
They didn't look like they had much control.
No, I mean, we always came in on the feet.
Yeah.
I watched them guys down there, all you see was arms and legs. You know, whoa.
George, thank you.
Alrighty,
Right, there's
Pleasure. George Laws.
Laws. George, keep smiling with catch again.
General Taylor sent in the whole division.
Remember, boys, give me 3 days and 3 nights of hard fighting, and you will be relieved. Another thing to remember, boys. Flies spread disease, so keep yours closed.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast, your favorite World War II based podcast. And we have a special guest tonight. If you're listening to the intro, which you should be because we're just starting the show, you should have a pretty good idea. But before we get into that, let's say hi to the very busy Father of the Year, Mr. Henry Sledge. What's going on, Henry? How are you doing, sir?
I'm okay. How are you?
I'm doing good. It's a Monday. My boss is on vacation for the first time in 15 years, so I'm kind of running things and just hoping that we can just make it through the week without any fires, and now that all look good, and we can all move on with our lives.
Nice.
Without any further ado, why don't you go ahead and introduce our guest?
Well, if you heard that voiceover there at the beginning, that was probably one of my top 2 or 3 favorite characters from Band of Brothers, and that would be George Luz. And so tonight on What's a Scuttlebutt, we've got my friend, I'm proud to call him my friend now, George Luz Jr. George, how are you doing?
Hey, great, Henry. Thank you so much for having me on. It'll be great to share the hour with you and Don.
Yeah, awesome, man.
Well, before the show started, George was telling us that it was his day out at the ranch, and we got to talking a little bit about horses. I'm like, well, hold up, let's stop this. I think we can all relate to this a little bit. So, how did horsing around and come down to your bloodline? How did you get involved in the equestrian lifestyle?
Is this one for Henry or me?
For you,
You're
sir.
the guest.
You're the guest. No one cares about Henry. They're over Henry. They've had.
Oh, okay.
They've had enough of Henry.
Sorry. Okay. Well, actually, when I was a kid, way back when, my cousin would help out cleaning stalls, and you get a chance to ride the horses. So when I was a kid, I did that a couple of summers. And there's a woman, Karen Dalton, in Foster, Rhode Island. And she has a Dare to Dream ranch, and that helps veterans and their families with things that they have to deal with during deployments and all those kinds of issues that crop up. So I met Karen 3 years ago, actually, and I had recently been retired, and I said, let's see, what can I do to help at the ranch that would give her an opportunity to do something more important? And that was to be a ranch hand. So Monday's my day. And
mucking out stalls, turning out horses, all the good stuff, huh?
It was fantastic. Yeah, it was a great day. It was a nice day. Tomorrow we're expecting some snow. And but yeah, just getting the horses out there, the horses, and they have goats. So, they have the whole equine therapy and goat therapy, and they've got fishing, trout fishing. And so it's a very comprehensive operation to help veterans. And we know they need help.
So,
Absolutely.
George, you find that the equine therapy and being around the animals and in a more natural bucolic setting, that's been proven, has it not? That's been proven to really help guys decompress. Is that kind of the thinking behind the whole process there, to just help these guys get over the PTSD, get more pleasant things on their minds?
Yeah, because it's just the veteran and the animals, and so it's amazing. Like Karen, one day when I first was there, she kind of explained to me how it works when you work with a horse, and the process that you go when building that relationship. And at the end of this 30 or 40 minutes of working with the horse, when you turn around and the horse follows you without you leading him along, it's just it gives you chills.
There's
The
something
thing
there's something
that
about a horse.
you do
It's like a horse. The only thing I can compare it to, if someone's never been around a horse and gotten the inner, a horse is like a golden retriever that can step on you. They're the most for the most part, they're the most gentle animal. You can feel them radiating love if they're well treated for, obviously. When I moved down here to Southwest Florida, I was taking on as many jobs as I could. I just doing whatever I could. And one of the things, and I had no history prior. Now, growing up in Kentucky, my grandfather, my aunts and uncles, they all had horses. Horses run in my bloodline, but I've never been around any horses. Anyhow, through channels of communications, I got a part-time gig down here mucking stalls and letting out horses. And as I tried to get Henry on a gotcha, but unbeknownst to me, he had experience with horses too. I'd learned the proper way to walk them out. And I remember one time I was letting out the horses, and one of the mothers of because it was an equestrian center, one of the mothers of the student asked me, like, how long have you been working with horses? They seem to love you. It's like, about a week and a half. But my family grew up with them. It's in my bloodline. And I have an overall, and we've talked about this a lot with dogs on this podcast, I am a huge animal lover, and animals, especially horses and, dogs and more smart breeds, they can pick up on your love and or fear or hatred for them, and they're like a mirror that way. They will reflect that, and they will treat you exactly how you treat them. Mm-hmm. Kind of like the old saying, sometimes you'd hear a woman say, oh, I judge whether or not I can date a guy by how my dog acts around him, because the dog picks up on how they act and whether or not they're quote unquote a good guy or not. So Henry, when did you get horses and that come into your lifestyle?
I worked when I was 27. I worked on a ranch in Colorado. It was in the White River National Forest. And I had been reading a bunch of Louis L'Amour books, really got into the whole West thing, and just, I was still single at that time. And I figured, man, if I'm going to do something like this, now's the time to do it before I get married and settle down. And I worked some contacts and in this day and age of the internet, it'd be tremendously easier. But back then,
Mm-hmm.
You had to fill out a job application and hard copy mail it. But I got put onto a place called Trappers Lake Lodge in the Flat Tops Wilderness area, White River National Forest. And I got hired as a wrangler, and I worked there all summer. And so it was kind of a crash course for me to learn horses. But I absolutely agree with what you say and what George indicated earlier. I mean, the horses, because we would see people come out there to do trail rides on this ranch who were terrified of horses.
Mm-hmm.
And they just sit there like complete idiots on top of the horse. Well, the horse figures out pretty quick, this person doesn't know what they're doing. They're scared, and they take advantage of that.
And as somebody who saw someone else riding that same horse the weekend prior who had a little more experience, that it's not the horse, it's the rider.
Yeah. But I love being around horses. I mean, it is therapeutic, and some have more common sense than others, but
like people.
Yeah. Sure. George could agree with that too.
No question about it.
So George, if you don't mind, let's talk a little bit about your father. Go on down memory lane a little bit.
Well, it's an interesting and it's really not unique. 16 million American men and women served their country during World War II, and when it was time to sign up, my dad did as well, and he arrived in Toccoa, Georgia, in August of 1942. and he joined the Airborne. And growing up in a depression, $50 extra a month was important, and that's exactly why he joined. Sometimes you think the romanticism of, he wanted to join because it was brand new concept and all that kind of stuff. But no, the $50 extra a month was something that was very important for him to why he joined. And I've got a clip of my dad talking about that, and he said his father, just like he said, my dad just wanted to cry and said, "What in the world are you going to do that for?" So, but anyway, yeah. So he was, he went through the training, and we know the numbers that they went through to get the officers and the enlisted guys and all that stuff. And like Garnier had said, this was kind of the cream of the cream, who made it through. And with the help of Captain Sobel, who they all despised, but all recognized that one of the major factors why they were successful was because of his training.
George, you said that. It's like you were reading my mind. I wanted to ask you, let's just immediately dive in on Easy Company. Did your dad talk about Captain Sobel? Because we know what we've read and heard about him and saw in the miniseries. What did George Luz say about Captain Sobel?
Well, you saw it. You saw it in the series there, where you had him cut the fences and things like that. So that was.
Is there a problem here, Captain Sobel?
That dog won't hunt.
Oh, I love that part.
So so that was one of the stories that I heard as a kid, because I was very fortunate. I went to reunions at 9 years old.
Yeah.
My first one was in Fort Campbell, Kentucky. My mom and dad took my sister and I. My brother Steve was a bit older, so he didn't come on that. Mm-hmm. But so getting a chance to hang out with these guys and listening to the stories, and then after all these years, you kind of grow up around them like you did as well, and you get a chance to meet these men and their wives at a different level and stuff. But yeah, so my dad, he shared a lot of stuff with me. I really wish I would have had the technology today then.
Yeah.
You're so blessed that, you've got so much of your dad's writings, and, wrote a book and the whole Bible story, man, that's just blows me away.
Well, that's a good, let's pause real quick there, because you and Henry share a similar position in modern day contemporary society. And that is, your father's legacy, and not only in the world of World War II, but in these particular miniseries. What would you do if you're in Henry's step? What would you do if you're in that position where there was a George Luz Bible that, Library of Congress said, "Hey, why don't you ship that bad boy out here?" Would you quickly do it, or would you hold on to it for a while?
What's that? The Bible?
Yeah.
Yeah, George, he's talking about the Bible. So I know you're not as familiar with the Pacific stuff and all that, but when my dad wrote With the Old Breed, his book, it was based on notes that he kept in his pocket New Testament.
Oh, yeah.
That he carried through the war, which I have. It's on that shelf over there. And I've got it in a box, padded up and everything. But that is like, really, man, people look at that like that was, and we're here to talk about you and your dad. All right. I didn't want to make this about me and my dad.
No, not at all. This is good stuff.
No, but you guys share this commonality that most people don't. And my question was, I don't know if maybe George didn't hear, but recently Henry was contacted by a person at the Congressional Library and asked Henry if they'd be willing to hand over the Bible for display.
Wow, that's I remember we had talked about that. Yeah, that's a tough one. I don't know, because that's got your dad's hands on it.
Yeah.
And when I look at everything around that we have from my dad, that's got my dad's hands on it, and that is such a significant thing, because I was looking back at the Pacific, because I had watched it, and I got a longer story about watching the series, how cool it was. But recently going over some of the stuff, listening to your mom, listening to your dad, when you put the puzzle together and you look at that, And, you know, number one, it's a Bible. Number one, it was in his hands. It was in the most difficult spot he was ever in. And he had the wherewithal to just put those little blurbs in there, those little words. And then he, you know, went back home and then expanded on it. So, man, I'll tell you what, I'm glad you've got to make that decision, because I don't know what in the world you would do on that one.
George, do you have, and Don, sorry did you want to ask something, Don? Or?
No, we got plenty of time. Go ahead.
George, do you have, because like me, you were probably really fascinated by World War II history growing up. I know I was. And my dad did have a lot of his artifacts, most of which I have. And did your dad have many of his things, like uniform clothing items, maybe his pack, a canteen, a knife? Did he bring a lot of stuff like that home with him, George?
He came home with absolutely nothing. And I'll tell you the story why.
Please.
Okay, so my dad, it's the end of the war, and he actually wrote this down. It's the end of the war, and he had to hitch a ride, and so he got dropped off, and now he's walking down the road back to wherever the company was. So here comes a German on a motorcycle. So he levels the gun at this German, and he convinces him to get off the motorcycle. After a dialogue back and forth, I'm sure the German didn't understand English, and my dad didn't understand German, but he had the rifle. So he got the guy off the bike. Now my dad gets on the bike. He never had a motorcycle. He grew up in a depression. He probably didn't have a bicycle. So he said it took him about 20 minutes to figure out what was going on. So he goes ambling on down the road, and then a couple of German girls called him, and he turned to look like every GI would, a couple of pretty girls. He turned to look and hit a bridge abutment.
Ooh.
And went crashing to the ground. So the MPs picked him up and brought him to a German hospital, and it was just, they looked at the calendar and the war had just ended. And my dad was in a German hospital. And so, you know, when you go into a hospital, you know, they cut all your clothes off, and, you know, because he was all banged up. And then, you know, his Foot Locker's back, you know, where the company is. And then it's like, hey, Luz isn't around. He's going to be in the hospital for a while. Hey, we don't know how long we're going to be here. So they just rifled through all of his stuff, I imagine. So he came up with absolutely nothing. And, but anyway, yeah, so my sister and I, right up until the very end when we sold the house, we were hoping beyond hope to find a corner of the house, the garage, the basement, where there was this box of just this cachet of things, and there was nothing. But anyway, you, on the other hand, you've got all kinds of cool stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I was really fortunate in that regard. And I think some of that kind of had to do with the fact that both my older brother and my dad, you know, they were really interested in historical things. And so, like, perhaps maybe a piece of equipment or a bayonet or something that maybe an ancestor had carried through the Civil War. We actually had some of that stuff. And my dad and my brother were always really into history. And so, which of course, I mean, my father bringing his things back, that was just his own decision, you know, as he was returning home from the war. But I've always considered myself so lucky that I could look at those things and like his combat pack.
Yeah.
You know, when I spoke in New Orleans in November, George, and you saw the video of it, and so did you, Don. I mean, I took my dad's combat pack over there and laid it on the table in front of us. And you can't see it too well in the video, but I mean, the pack he carried through the entire war. And if you turn it over, you know, the inside of it, what would be against his back, you see, you know, it says Sledge EB K35, you know, and then a geometric symbol for the 1st Marine Division. And it's just, I mean, those are, to just be able to lay your hands on something that was there.
Yeah.
It's just, man, there's something so visceral about that.
Yeah.
You know, George, your father's story is very reminiscent of Shifty Powers. He got to go home, was put on a truck, got in a truck accident, and landed up in the hospital. And by the time he got home, all his belongings were gone too. Very similar. So poor Shifty didn't get anything either.
the answer to that is don't get injured at the end of the war.
Well, well, and you say that perfectly, because anybody who's read the books, I think the time that from the surrender until people got to go home en masse, they're saying like almost just as many guys are dying in car accidents, drunk driving accidents, accidental discharge. Like after the war, people were still dying from just happenstance and tomfoolery. I mean, we all heard what happened to Patton, but it was happening all around just because you have that many guys there, alcohol, good times and bad accidents. We're not talking about, anti-lock brakes. Most of that stuff was all drum brakes, no power steering, and just technology in and of itself wasn't as safe as it is nowadays. Let me ask you this, because one of the huge differences, I mean, there's a lot of them, but one of the differences, and primarily because of when it was made, at the time of the production of Band of Brothers, so many of the guys are still alive, and they were able to do those pre-episode interviews, which for a lot of historians, that was one of our favorite parts of the episode. I love opening up. And when you first watch the series, you might get annoyed that they don't put the little name down there, but if you watch that series enough, you get to know there's Malarkey, there's Shifty Powers, and to this day, I see the photos of guys, I know who they are. You said earlier, because you had started going to the reunions at such a young age, what was it like for you by the time that miniseries came out to see these guys that you've just known forever, whether they had the generic nickname of an uncle or a friend of my dad's? What was it like to see them doing these pre-episode interviews when that series came out?
Well, that was like you said, that was my favorite too, was to hear it in their own voices. The actors all did a spectacular job. They did an amazing job. And, kind of growing up around those guys and, and knowing them all very well. And when my dad was killed, I got to really connect with them at a different level. I wasn't Luz, but I was Luz's kid. And, it really chokes you up now, especially now that they're all gone. Fortunately enough, the kids were still connected, whether it's the Compton kids, the Carsons, the Langlois, Chris Langlois, the Gordons, the Garniers, and on and on and on. And so it's good that we're able to kind of stay connected. Actually, before I was kind of getting set up, I had the tape of Walter Gordon being interviewed by Stephen Ambrose as they were leading up to writing the book.
Wow.
What Ambrose did was he got together with several of the men and did interviews with them because they lived in actually the same community. So I listened to that, and I'm sure it's great for you too, Henry. Is you've got tape on your dad. I was watching some of it this past week. You've got tape of your dad talking, and that's got to be very comforting.
It is, yeah, George. It is.
Not to mention his mother in the director's cut of the Pacific.
Oh yeah, man, that's a tough one right now. It's hard for me to hear her voice right now.
Yeah, but you'll be glad it's there 10, 15 years from
now.
Oh
yeah, no, I know.
And not to mention Henry's beautiful head of hair back then too. I mean, in that video, his hair was on point.
Oh, he had to throw that in there.
Well, we were all different. Mine is so gray.
Nah.
I started going gray at 16. Don't even worry about
it. Yeah.
Well,
but speaking of your mom, I want to read one thing about your mom. Well, I could read more, but I'd like to just read this because she's talking about your dad. And she says he had been through the worst that life could have thrown at him, and he knew that he was able to stand up to it. Which, when I heard her say that, I had to write it down because it was just, it was a great quote from your mom.
Wow, man, no, that's powerful. I remember her saying that.
Yeah.
But did you? When were your parents married, George? I mean, were they? So, like, my mom and dad got married in 1952.
Okay.
So when my dad was going through, and I was born in '65, so when Dad was going through all that, he and my mom didn't even know each other.
Mm-hmm.
But they got married in 1952. So for you, were your parents, did they get married pretty soon after the war? How did that shake out?
Yeah, because I was born in 56. So I think that they were born in, I think that they got married in either 57 or 58.
Okay.
Because my brother is 8 years older. So yeah, 57 or 58. No, sorry. No. 47 or 48.
Okay.
47 or 48. Now, we lived in a community, and so my dad's good buddy, sister. Now, so everything is so close, but my dad's good buddy, Tony, his sister ended up being my dad's wife, Dell.
Okay.
Back in the day, my mom's family had 12 brothers and sisters, and my
Catholic, were they?
father's side had 10. So they had a bunch of them. They were Portuguese. So,
yeah.
And I guess they had a lot of kids. But so they got married in 47, 48, somewhere in that range, because I was born in 56.
Okay. Well, so you're the same age as my brother.
Okay.
My brother came along in 57.
Oh, all right. Yeah.
So
it's amazing how old we are.
Yeah.
Jeez Louise. I say to myself, am I really 66? I don't feel 60. Well, some days I feel 66.
Yeah.
After working out at the ranch today, I feel a little 56, 66. But yeah, that quote, I've been watching some stuff, on your dad and your mom, and that little piece there that HBO did was great. Let me tell you a quick story, if I may.
Please. Have at it.
So anyway, so here we go. It's the premiere of the Pacific is coming to Boston.
Mm-hmm.
So my buddy Tim Gray from the World War II Foundation.
Yeah, Tim Gray.
Hey, can you get any tickets for that? And I said, sure. So anyway, so I called Marav Brooks, and I said, hey, Marav, could you get a couple tickets for us to go to that? And she said, yeah, that would be fine. And, what's the names and all that stuff. So she does all of that. And so we end up getting a chance to go there. And Bruce McKenna was there also.
Yeah, my buddy Bruce.
Yeah, so I told a friend of mine, I said, hey, get in touch with Bruce and just tell him I'm going to be there, blah, blah, blah. So we were able to get together and see Bruce. And then he brought us in to hang out with Tom. Mm-hmm. Kurt Sandusky was there. So Bruce is being interviewed, and Bruce is being interviewed by the TV, and I'm just kind of standing in his sight line. So I'm figuring, okay, when he's done, if he looks up, he sees me, came over, we chit-chatted. I said, hey, man, I'm sure you're as busy as can be. And so afterwards, we're standing downstairs looking around, and then he comes running down the stairs at the Kennedy Library and gives us the universal signal to come this way. Mm-hmm. So we start following him up the stairs. We go up the stairs, around the corner, down the hall, and boom, and then we're in Tom's room. So I got a chance to see Kurt Sandusky, and got a chance to hang out a little bit with Tom. But the interesting thing was there was this Pacific veteran. His name was Joe Drago, and he was sitting right next to us, my wife and I. So we got a chance to watch it with him. And every week after that, I would call him up on like the Monday, and we would just talk about the episode, because he was, a Pacific vet, and he was, in a lot of the same places your dad was. And I would ask him just different stories about that, this and that. And the funniest story was, I guess there was a gunny sergeant who was walking along. It started raining, and then he pulled a bar of soap out. And I said,
Gunny Sergeant Haney.
I said, did you have a guy like that? He says, sure.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, what differentiates Haney from everybody else is, as Henry's father so eloquently put it, is he would wash certain parts of his body with a steel wool brush.
But yeah, that was great. And then the crust of that story was, so Joe Drago comes to he goes with a friend of his, a buddy of friend. I think it was a police officer. They couldn't get tickets. And he said, screw it, let's just go. So they show up. He comes up to the girl with the booklet and all that stuff in the programs. And the girl said, oh, hi, sir, what's your name? And he said, Joe Drago. So she's looking at the list and can't find his name, and the other girl, they can't find the name, and the girl looks up and he looks at the girl and said, "My name's not on that list, but I was there." And she takes a program and a hat and slides it across and says, "Go right in, sir."
Perfect.
You know, so anyway, Joe Drago was just a super guy, and like I said, he was my connection to the Pacific, watching each and every episode.
Well, see, that's cool that, with your father being ETO and a key figure in Band of Brothers and all of that, that's cool that when the Pacific came out, you were that interested.
Yeah.
I love, man, that's awesome. So take us back to when Band of Brothers, when did you first read Ambrose's book, Band of Brothers?
Well, it came out in '92.
Yeah.
And naturally, my dad came home from the reunion, from the book opening. And so he came home with a bunch of books and gave us all our book. And that's when I kind of dove into it. And so that was the first time I had read it and stuff. And then there's so many, like your dad's story, like, all those guys, there's so many books out there that's got so much cool information. And same thing with, Band of Brothers. Webster's book, I don't know if you've ever read.
Parachute Infantryman.
Oh, man, I love that one.
It's a great book.
Yeah, there's a lot of my dad in the second part of that.
I'll have to get that one.
It really shows the essence of that. Don, have you read Parachute Infantry?
I do not have that one. I have a bunch of Easy Company based books. I have I got Garnier and Heffron's Best of Friends. Yep. I got Hang Tough. Sure. I got a bunch of them, but I don't have that one. Well, that's what I wanted to ask too, for Henry brought it up. We know that many of your father's generation didn't talk about it too much because everybody was there. So why talk about it? We all experienced everybody was there. How did he feel about when the book came out that all the guys that he served with were the main focus of this book? How did he feel about that?
Well, the interesting thing with my dad was when Ambrose initially sent out the flyers and said, okay, because they all met, at the Modillon Hotel in New Orleans. And then after some discussions, it's like, hey, we could probably write a book about this. So we want everybody to fill out these forms that Ambrose is going to send out. And my sister is the one who really deserves the credit for that, my sister Lana, because she was the one who kind of leaned on my dad and said, hey, Dad, you've got to fill out this form. Because he really didn't care.
Sure.
He just felt as though, hey, I was there with these guys. I'm sure my name's going to be in there somewhere. It's not that big of a deal. But my sister leaned on him to fill out that form. And yeah, he was super proud of serving with those guys. And what he would have liked, there's a couple of things he really would have liked about the series was, the series, it had guys going everywhere. They were doing this and they were doing that, and they were invited to this Super Bowl and the Kentucky Derby and World Series games and all kinds of stuff. And all those extra trips that HBO and Jeep put together, he would have loved the extra time with the guys.
Yeah.
Because he got together every year. They got together every year, my mom and stuff with all the guys and their wives. And that's what he really would have loved, was the extra time with the guys. Not as much the glory. Well, I guess, for lack of a better term, the glory of it all. It would be that extra time with the men who he loved so much, and they loved each other.
Real quick question, because I'm just about wrapping up The Longest Day, the book, not the movie. I like the book so much better, but I digress. And I came up with a question for you. You may not know this, maybe you don't. Do you know, because obviously D-Day, invasion, all havoc, pilots are dropping guys low, dropping them fast, dropping them here, dropping them there, just get them out of the plane, let's get the hell out of here. Do you recall where your father actually landed on D-Day? How far from his DZ he ended up, maybe who he linked up with first after getting his gear together and figuring out where the hell he was?
Well, actually, Paul Woodage, famous historian in Normandy, And he's the one who actually, we worked together with a group. I can't remember if it was a Tim Gray event. And so he had us go out with Paul. And so Paul was telling us different stuff. And he said, this guy landed here and this guy landed here. And then he said, Harry Welch. He said, okay, so Harry Welch landed right in this area here. So I said, hey, my dad was second in the stick right back of Harry. So he said, okay, well, let's look at the map. The wind was blowing this way. And he says, okay, so your dad landed in between this area and this area, however many feet after where Harry landed. But when my dad landed, he didn't really see anybody. He ended up running into an officer from headquarters company. And, but yeah, so I kind of know where he landed thanks to Paul Woodage.
I love Woody. He does great work.
Yeah.
It's amazing
cool that he was able.
It's amazing how small this community is, because we've had him on the show. We all know him. And just like every time we have a new guest on, everybody knows everybody. It's just even worldwide, it's such a great small community. I love it.
It certainly is. It certainly is. And, we just look at how blessed we are, the connections, the friendships that we've made. And every time we go back to Europe, you get a chance to plug into people. You're in Bastogne, you're Fred, Reg, or Frankie Gubbles, or, Ron Stasman. The list is endless.
Now, obviously, amongst young cats like that, even outside of war, even if you're just, a group of guys who've known each other since a long time or gone through something, there's always a tale that's told at every reunion, a story, if you will, lore. Is there anything that you can remember from all your time going to those reunions before the fame and all that, and after, you're 5 or 6, oh, great, there's Dad telling that story again, or, oh, there's Mr. Winters telling that story again. Is there a particular story you remember that was lore or legend that just you heard it every year to a certain point? You're like, oh, now with this again? Is there anything like that our audience might enjoy hearing because they've never heard it 1,000 times?
Well, Walter Gordon said it very well. He said something about, you're never quite sure if it's a legend result of a fact or a fact resulting from a legend. I'm not quite sure which one, but yeah, well, I can share the kinds of stuff. I could say the men always talked about more of the humor of everything that was going on. And they were living more in the now. And that was one of the other things I noticed. It was more in the now than a lot of the stories. Although, maybe when all the drinking was going on, I was probably in bed when some of those stories were being told. Well, but you got to remember, when my very first reunion at 9 years old, I've said this before, I was happy the place had a pool. So
it's like,
well, that's important.
That's like Henry Big Time and Snafu when he was a kid.
Don loves this story.
Love that story. Snafu comes over, he's hanging out with Henry's dad, and Henry's dad's like, Henry, I want to introduce you to somebody. He's like, hey, what's up? I got some baseball. I'm out of here.
That's not okay. Don's exact. So, George, what he's talking about is you saw the Pacific. You know who Snafu was. He and my dad were gunner, assistant gunner. Snafu was gunner. My dad was assistant gunner on the 60. And so Snafu was from Louisiana. And when they didn't really keep in touch or anything until my dad's book came out, which was 1981. Okay. Well, so, Snafu Shelton over there in Louisiana somehow comes upon a copy of the book, or probably not long after it came out, because it's like, oh, Peleliu, Okinawa, well, I was there, and then finds out he's a starring character in my father's memoir, as he should have been. And so anyway, in 1984, which is 3 years after With the Old Breed came out, he and my dad reconnected, and he and his wife came over to Alabama to visit my parents. And so I was home from college because I had just started college that year, and I come walking in, and I'm walking down the driveway of my parents' house, and I see a car with Louisiana plates on it, and I didn't know who it was, and I go walking in, and I walk in the living room, and, my parents are in there entertaining guests, and there's this kind of stocky, short guy sitting there, and my dad says, Henry, this is Snafu. Snafu, this is my son Henry. And I was like, yes, sir. It's a pleasure to meet you. He said, yeah, your daddy and I were good friends in World War II, And I was like, yes, sir. And, I knew who he was.
Yeah.
I'd grown up here in Snafu. And then, I was just like, okay, I'm just gonna go. I'm going to a party tonight. And I just, oh my God, I wish I just.
So Henry had a party to go to. Young George was busy doing cannonballs and backflips in the pool.
I wish I just sat there and listened to them.
No. You're exactly right. And I'll tell you a story. I'll tell you a story similar to that. So it's the 1981 reunion, and I actually told the story recently. Yeah, it's the 81 reunion in San Diego. Buck Compton was kind of the host. So I got a chance to meet Buck's two daughters, Cindy and Tracy, and Walter Gordon's two of Walter Gordon's four daughters, Bibi and Linda, and Marianne Malarkey. And my parents brought my old girlfriend on the trip too, Nina. I was living in Denver at the time. And but anyway, yeah, so one night, we were all just kind of hanging out, and so we ended up going to some bar. So everybody was hanging out back over here telling those stories, and I just went with Marianne couldn't go because she was only 16. So I just went with a bunch of the girls, and we just went to some bar and just laughed and giggled, I'm sure. And didn't hear the stories. So I can understand that going to the bar thing. Because you were probably, what, 20, 21 or?
I was 19.
19, okay.
Yeah, I was 19. I remember the day, man. And God, looking back, I wish I just sat there and soaked it up. Because, man, I just like you with your dad, talking about his Easy Company buddies. I mean, I remember my dad talking about Elmo Haney when I was a little kid.
Mm-hmm.
I remember the name Snafu. I mean, we almost named one of our dogs Snafu. We ended up not. We went another direction. But, I mean, it was just, it was part of your, you know what I'm talking about, man. It's just part of your DNA.
Yeah. Yeah, whenever I meet, especially, with the emergence of the series, when I would meet some of the kids I hadn't met, and we've known each other for 20 years, and I'd say, we've only known each other for this period of time, but we go back to 1942 in Tacoma, Georgia.
Yeah,
and that's kind of how we feel. It's a depth of it, and you've got the same thing. You're dealing with the same kind of a thing there.
It's kind of like your third cousins or something.
You're way ahead of me, George, because. And I kind of wanted to explore this with you because, like, everybody knows how close I am to my dad's story and how passionate I am about that history and how I feel about K-35. With you, it's Easy Company. With me, it's K-35, K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. But I grew up hearing about all of that, but I didn't go to reunions. I mean, my dad didn't go to a reunion until after his book came out. And I didn't have that. That's an awesome experience for you. It's like the Easy Company kids were like extended family for you. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't have that. I didn't have that angle of it, but I do feel like K Company, and certainly I met some K Company sons and daughters when the Pacific came out, and that was kind of cool. But I met Bill Layden's son, who, Bill Layden, and you were very familiar with Pacific. He was. I loved his character. He was the one on Okinawa that was like, she wrote him a letter. A letter. She's not your wife. She's not your wife. But Bill Layden was a wonderful man. I mean, he was the first. He was the first guy, George. He was the first guy that I called when my dad died.
Wow. Yeah,
and he was just a wonderful man.
Yeah. Well, and you can have that. You can have that too with their kids if they're receptive, because not all the kids are receptive. They've all got their own lives, and sometimes we talk about that. When we're at a reunion and it's this core of us that go to the reunions, and we just say, hey, how can we and we've got some next generation too. We got some, grandson, granddaughter. Don Malarkey's granddaughter comes to the reunions, and so just to kind of bring the group together even more, and then we just come to the realization that okay, hey, people know that we're getting together. If they want to join us, they certainly can, and if they don't, hey, let's face it, everyone's life is busy,
Right.
and their dad's service may be important, but not that important to go on a vacation and hang out with people because we do something very similar that the men do. They didn't just sit around and talk about, this battle or that battle. There was a certain amount of that. I'll tell you, when you got a chance to sit there and listen to the 3rd Platoon guys, whether it was Paul Rogers and Shifty and Earl McClung, just kind of sitting there, and those 3 guys would be talking, and we'd all be kind of sitting around the edges, not saying a peep, and just listening to them tell their stories. And the old story about Earl with the house of ill repute, let's just say, I guess he went in some house and they're shooting the thing up and whatever it was, but just listening to these guys tell these stories, and we're just sitting there just enjoying the heck out of them, watching their interaction together.
Because in that moment, they're back with each other.
Yeah.
And it's like, so I didn't experience that, George, like in person like you did. But what I did experience was, like, my dad hated talking on the phone. I mean, it was a joke. When I was a kid, I'd call him on the phone when I was in college, and he just, okay, all right, bye. He was just real abrupt. He hated talking on the phone. You let one of his old K Company buddies call him, and he would just shut the door, and my mom would just come out rolling her eyes. And he'd be on the phone for 3 hours.
Yeah.
And this is back before we had unlimited calling. Long distance bills.
Yeah, really.
Oh, I know. Can you imagine? Because you're exactly right. If you were in Rhode Island and you called this Mississippi, Alabama, whatever it is, that's a toll call.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it's not like unlimited. So, but there was a lot of correspondence too. Did your dad correspond a lot with his
Yes.
letters and stuff and cards and?
He did, George, and that the guy, I don't know. You're very familiar with the miniseries. Don, you know who Doc Caswell was. Yep. One of the things, George, that he talked about Doc Caswell in the book quite a bit. Doc Caswell was Kent Caswell. He was a Navy corpsman attached to them, to the mortar platoon. And he did not make it into the miniseries. Just, Bruce and I talked about that. I mean, okay, so the scene in part 7, George, where they have, and Don, I don't mean to be talking to you, but you know the series.
I was going to say they gave that role to the Doc of Lecky's platoon. He's the one they showed on all the scenes.
But when they were up in the hills of Peleliu in part 7, and they're sitting there taking 5 or taking 10, whatever, and Sledge sees the dead Japanese soldiers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he sees those gold teeth. And he's thinking about it because he saw Snafu do it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in the miniseries, he pulls his K-bar out, which is right there.
Yep.
Wow.
He pulls his K-bar out, and he's about to do it. And Snafu says, "What you doing, Sledgehammer? Don't. Germs. All these nips got germs." It was Doc Caswell who really did that.
Oh, okay.
Kent Caswell was the one who really did that. And Don, there's a lot of stuff about Kent Caswell in the unpublished portions that I've come across that didn't make it into With the Old Breed. But yes, to your point, George, like he and Doc Caswell exchanged Christmas cards for many, many, many years. And the cool thing about all my dad's papers being archived at Auburn University, all these letters, all this correspondence, is there. And I've been able to I want to go spend a couple of days at those archives and really dig through his letters. I mean, hell, I remember a bunch of them coming to him in the mailbox, but yeah, I mean, there's a wealth of information in those letters, and just like with your dad, I mean, they wrote to each other.
Well, that's a great thing to have those as a resource. And then it's just within the body of, you could just kind of see how much these guys loved each other, with whether it was, you know, the way they opened it, whether how they closed it, just those little lines in there that were written with just feeling beyond feeling and stuff. And it's great to have that stuff. And you know, I've got a bin full of things that my dad had with his buddies and stuff. So it is really neat and comforting to go back and read those, and then to kind of connect the dots with some of these things. You know, connect them with a picture or something like that. Or I was going through a few things recently there where I just kind of connected a few dots and stuff, and which is really cool to do that. And I'm really blessed, you know, because I travel with Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. And so I go with my buddy Chris Anderson. He's the senior historian, or maybe one of the senior historians, but he knows the men better than anybody, because he spent the most amount of time with the men. Ron Drez did as well, but Chris really spent a lot of time with the men. So I travel with them, and in Webster's book, there's this passage in Webster's book when they were in Haguenau. And you saw it in the series where my dad was flipping candy bars to the guys.
I was watching that scene today.
Jesus Christ, I have some of your rich...
Oh, he gets a Hershey bar? Well, he got shot in the ass. You didn't get shot in the ass. You got shot in the ass, get a Hershey bar.
Hey, you got to be shitting me.
I watched that scene earlier today.
So anyway, yeah, so that story, and if you remember after that story, they talk about, I got to go blast the building web.
Yeah.
Right. So there's this young kid. Now I read it in Webster's book, and it's like, oh man, I'm hoping that this story is going to come in the series. It didn't. But anyway, I always wondered what building they were talking about. So I got a message from this young kid, historian in Haguenau, Tom Fry. And he says, hey, you know, he introduced himself. And I said, hey, you wouldn't happen to know what building my father blasted, would you? And he said, I certainly do. So my last trip over there last July, I think it was. My last trip with Ambrose last year. I met with Tom and his girlfriend. I think it was his girlfriend or his wife. So he brought me to the building, and he explained, and we read through Webster's passage, and you know, he brought me to the spot, and he says, okay, OP3 was here. They talked directly across the river was the house that they blasted. So what he did was he went to those houses that are right there, and he met this little old lady who's like 90. And so she was there during the war. So he asked her, he says, you know, at the end of the war, you know, what was going on? She said, well, when we came back to our house, it was blown apart on the inside. So that is indicative of my father with the bazooka, because he took 3 shots with the bazooka. And so it was kind of really neat to kind of close the loop on that particular story.
Yeah.
And it was interesting was after, you know, Tom kind of put it all together, I said, how come I couldn't figure that out? Because I knew where OP3 was too. And, you know, sometimes you're not really thinking, but yeah, because it was directly across the river. So I've been there so many times, and now, you know, the next time I go, I'll point that building out to our guests and say, that's the building that he blasted there.
Over how many years have you been going over there?
Well, I've been traveling with Ambrose since 16 on their tours. And I think my very first trip, I don't know, it might have been the premiere in 2001. My wife and I do a lot of traveling anyway, but the very first trip to Normandy, I think, was in 2001 to Normandy.
The reason I ask is obviously
the world premiere.
The reason I ask is obviously when the veterans go back, things have changed substantially. But in the amount of time you've gone, are those areas kind of captured in time, or has progress changed a lot of that scenery just in the short period you've been going?
Well, you know, let's say Bastogne, for example. The trees in Bastogne, trees in that region of the world are a resource. So the trees were in, let's say, the Borjak, those weren't the trees that were there then. those are probably 2 or 3 generations, because trees grow for 20 or 30 years and then they cut them down and plant new ones. For example, where Winter's CP was, let's go to where Winter CP, and that area's been cut. So they're growing new trees there as well. But by and large, though, there's a lot of places that time has stood still. And, they've done a great job of trying to keep this stuff together and capture and preserve that history. Yeah, and I am so blessed to be able to travel with Ambrose and do all of that stuff. And people say, well, why do you go on the same trip? You go on the Band of Brothers trip, most every time. But it's like, I know the story, but it's different guests every time. So it's a different tour. And I get a chance to share these stories with all these people about my dad. And I do a speech halfway through with audio clips and video clips and stuff. And it's just a bless, I'm just blessed to be able to do that. And people people have a passion for history. So I think we're in a unique position, Henry, to be able to share these stories.
It was, as you talk about going back and to Normandy and Bastogne and going to Haguenau, it's probably, George, for you, the same feeling I got, which it's not nearly as accessible, but I went to Peleliu in 1999. And when we went to that sector of Orange Beach too, where K-35 came ashore, I will never forget the feeling I had seeing that water. And of course, my situation was a little bit different because my father did eloquently describe it in a book that got published and a lot of people read it, and so I reread those chapters time and time and time again when I was on that trip, and the airfield where they attacked across, in which he described, he said that was probably the most terrifying experience of the war for him, was charging across that airfield on D+1 at Peleliu, because they were under really heavy fire. And to walk across, and my friend Eric Maylander was on that trip, and I said, Eric, put me on that airfield. I want to go across right where my dad went across. He said, okay, I know right where to put you. And so he did, and a gentleman named, he was Colonel Joseph Alexander. He's actually the guy I named my son after. He was a Marine Vietnam. He was a Vietnam Marine, but a well-known historian. He was on that trip. He and I became dear friends. He and my dad were already friends because he had written about my dad and some things. But I can remember him saying, hey, let's just give Henry a few minutes here. And I just kind of walked around and, listened to the jungle sounds. And it was hot. The heat was radiating off that coral, but not nearly as hot as it would have been, but for you, to go back to Normandy, so obviously your dad probably came down pretty close to Saint-Mère-Église.
Yeah. Actually, there's kind of a parking lot in the back. Let's say you're looking at the side door. Everybody goes in the side door. So if you go up to the right in the back, there's a parking lot. There's a cemetery in the parking lot, and up in that parking lot is where he landed.
Is that right?
But yeah, so that must be really cool for you to go back, to Peleliu and to stand there, and we know the significance of not even the significance of the battle, but the reality is your dad was right there, and you're able to walk in his footsteps.
Well, it's just like when you go to that parking lot. Don't you just stand there and think, man, you look around and he came down right here. Yeah. And that's the amazing thing is, just we're walking through their footsteps. Yeah.
And,
by no
were you ever in the military, Don?
No. My microphone.
Don, it got better there for a little while, but it's pretty fuzzy right now.
Well, I think the biggest problem is
Perfect.
Hurricane Ian, no power for 16 days, so all my windows. So my mixing board got a lot of humidity on it during that period of
Well, now you're
hurricane.
good.
I had to change. I went from pot 4 to pot 3. I literally switched to a different pot. It's crazy. But what I was trying to say is, we by no means want to stymie the growth of an area, particularly areas in the South Pacific. And so you want those countries to thrive and their people to grow. But there's part of us as historians, we hate to see those battlefields produced, turn into something else. And when I watch a lot of the video footage of like Guadalcanal, so much of that has changed. Like you see all these houses and buildings now around some of those areas. Once again, you can't say, oh, you guys can't develop. You're happy to see that things are developing, but there's part of you, just a little part that wishes maybe you could just leave that little area alone. But, you know, that's kind of the cross we all have to bear.
Yeah. How do you strike that balance?
Yeah.
Right. How do you strike that balance?
Especially because in a country where people are doing whatever they can to feed their families and come up with any sort of revenue, opposed to, you know, a developed nation.
Yeah.
And then you look at every corner, every street, every one of these areas has something going on.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
You know, the joke that Easy Company won the war, and hey, nobody else did anything else, and that whole joke that you hear the Easy Company guys and actually say, hey, no, we were just one small part of it, and but you read about there were great stories around every turn. And, that was one of the things, sitting with Paul Woodage and Chris Anderson and discussing being a historian, being a guide in Normandy, let's just say.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
In the wealth of stories, heroic stories that can be shared, but because they're not tied to a specific battle, they remain undiscussed. But they're just as significant in the same level of heroics went into these battles. And so that's the challenge historians have is telling people more of the stories, not just the story that they saw in the miniseries or they read in this book, the World War II Guide for Dummies, which is the book I read in the beginning.
And the nice thing is there's so many stories out there and so many people out there, and somewhere something's documented, that there is so much material for future productions to bring other people's names to light. A few episodes back, I was here gushing about how I loved Rogue Heroes, and I thought it was great. I didn't know anything about how the SAS got formed and the guys who brought that to life. In this miniseries that's produced by the same people who did Peaky Blinders, is presenting the story of the SAS, the British Special Air Force, their paratroopers, in a way that doesn't, for people who may not be interested in World War II per se, but the show is done in such a way that you don't have to be a World War II aficionado or historian to love the show, because it's kind of modernized, but it's still World War II and it still gets a message across, and it's done really well. I know Henry was checking out a few episodes.
Yep.
But my point being is there's so much material out there that we all know Hollywood's gone creatively bankrupt and they just remake the same crap over and over again. So maybe someone goes digging through some old library books, they'll find a book from 1954 that maybe wasn't a bestseller but has some great stories and great characters in it, and we can bring those people to light too. So there's so much material out there.
George, I know how my dad felt about this. Did your dad care much for war movies?
You like the sound of music. You like the sound of music because it reminded him of Austria. A quick story. When we were kids, I think that movie came out in 1965.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was 65. And we all went. It was my mom and my dad. My brother didn't come again. So my sister and I, we were in the station and we saw that movie in 1965. And then in New Hampshire, Stowe, Vermont, they have a place, and it's similar to the Van Trapp family or whatever the situation is. I can't remember exactly, but yeah. So anyway, yeah. So he liked that one. But I'm trying to think which war movies we may have watched. Dirty Dozen, and
My dad hated him. He had no desire. I will tell you this. So this is skipping ahead a bunch of years, but when Saving Private Ryan came out, okay, so Dale Dye called my dad, and I wasn't there when this happened. My dad told me about it. Dale Dye called my dad and was, kind of, because that was the first time they'd done the whole actor boot camp thing. It was the first time they really used that business model, if you will. And so Dale Dye called my dad up and was kind of talking up Saving Private Ryan and how realistic it was, and you ought to see it. You'd find it very interesting or something like that. And I remember my dad told me, he said, Dale, there's a better chance of me going in that kitchen and put my hand on a hot stove than there is of watching that movie. He says, I don't need to watch the movie. I've already seen it.
That's right. He lived it. Yeah.
But
right.
I lived in Ohio. I lived in Ohio at the time, and my grandparents were in Kentucky, so I didn't get to talk to my grandfather, who was there, about his impression, especially the opening scene. But from what I understood, he told my mom that very realistic, very reminiscent of what he remembered. But I was too young then, and I wasn't around to get his take on it. But from what I understood, it was a hard watch.
Well, my dad, I went to see the movie with my father. Winters was invited to go out to a premiere in Hollywood. And then he sent all of the guys in the company this letter. And it just said, he explained I was invited to go out there, blah, blah, blah. And I encourage all you guys to go see this. So, and actually there's a video of my dad explaining that. So we go. All right, now my dad wasn't the most patient guy. And you know how movies are.
Mm-hmm.
You go in, you sit down.
45 minutes of previews.
Yeah. So like my dad is getting a bit fidgety, and I was getting fidgety because I know he was getting fidgety. So anyway, okay, so here comes the movie. We watched the whole movie. And, so we know what we saw. So the movie's over. We all stand up. And it's quiet, and they're rolling the credits. And my father looks at me and says, "What the hell was that?" We weren't in any of those places. They were marching too close together.
Watch your intervals, damn it.
So anyway, I think that was his mechanism of, well, there were two reasons. One of them was to diffuse whatever emotions he had just endured.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. And the second one was, because they were trashing the airborne guy. What do we got to go and save this airborne guy for? And, but anyway, so that was kind of funny. So people are like looking at this guy saying, what is going on with this guy? But that's a good question. I'm not sure. We did go to see that, but I think he kind of went a little begrudgingly. I think he went as Winter said, you got to go.
Yeah.
And so he did.
When you're telling that story, I had a thought, a memory. Different movie, but when it comes to a World War II movie that had a huge impact on pop culture at the time. And I remember I saw it with my parents, Schindler's List. Mm-hmm. In that theater, by the time the credits were rolling, all you heard, if you heard anything, was people trying to cover up the fact that they're crying. That movie was so damn powerful and had such an impact on society and pop culture at the time. Like, to this day, I almost think that should be required watching for like high school history class, even though nowadays they wouldn't let it. But that is such a powerful movie. But I didn't have the opportunity to see Saving Private Ryan in the theater, but I'm sure for a lot of people it was very, especially after that closing scene with the older Matt Damon, I hope I made you proud. I'm sure walking out of there, it was probably pretty quiet with the exception of your dad saying, what the hell was that? They're too close together.
Yeah.
Their jackets were the wrong color. Oh, they put Vaseline on the lens, Dad. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. That was a riot. But no, that the run of them, when we look at it, with your dad, Henry, we look at the emotions that these guys had to deal with, what they saw, and then a lot of people say, when they came home, they didn't share a lot of stories, and Hey, for good reason. Why in the world would a soldier want to come home and share the ugliest things that he has ever witnessed in his life with his wife, his son, his daughter, his brother, his sister? He wants, in most cases, these guys just want to put that away.
Oh yeah, of
You know?
course. I remember my mom telling me that when, and she was digging back through the years, but when my dad came home, which again, she didn't meet him till, 1951, I guess. But she had heard, like, my aunt or my great aunt and my grandmother, she had heard them talk through the years. And when my dad came home from the Pacific, they were almost scared of him. Not that he was psychotic and going to go nuts, but just for one thing, my dad grew up in a pretty genteel, he was brought up in a genteel way. We'll just say that, very well bred. And, it's like when he came home, his mannerisms, his language, his table manners, it was all just, he had just become this person that his family didn't recognize.
Wow.
And
Platoon.
And it was,
the scene in Platoon. And they're talking about going home. And the one guy said, he's like, how you going to act when you're eating in front of dinner in front of your mom? Pass the effing potatoes, Mom. He's talking about how he went back on a short leave and then came back because he got wounded. And the other guy's like, I'm 3 more weeks, I'm out of here. And talking about all the stuff he's going to do. And he's like, well, how are you going to act around your family when you're home? Because you're not going to be the same person. And how shocked his mom was when hearing his dialogue, his vernacular, being in the Marine Corps for so long and then being home. That's kind of what it reminds me of when you're talking about his behavior and the way he acted.
Yeah, and I know there was one time where my mom said my dad had gone into the back room and laid down to take a nap one afternoon. And his aunt, my great aunt, my grandmother's sister, went back there and was looking for him. Where's Eugene? Where's you? She went back there and went up to him and grabbed him by the shoulder and tried to shake him awake. And he came up with his hands around her throat.
Mm-hmm.
And then he immediately, when he realized, he felt terrible when he realized what had happened. So I'm not trying to create drama where drama didn't exist, but I mean, he came up at her and put his hands around her throat, and then he caught himself. But it was, the point of that was that, here's my genteel great aunt, his aunt, who just shakes him awake, and it was just this completely different plane of existence, and the same for the guys that had been in the ETO. I mean, they had to adapt and then come home and decompress and somehow reassimilate back into what that normalcy was.
Yeah, well, all the guys who were in the European theater look at your dad and the guys in the Pacific, and they realize that your father and the guys in the Pacific had it much worse than the guys in Europe. I think in the case of my dad and his buddies, when they came home, they all came home on a troop ship. Well, a group, groups of them. Some guys had points. My dad had enough points to come home. So, a lot of these guys came home together. And so they were able to kind of decompress for 10 days or 2 weeks, whatever it was, which probably helped them out to a certain degree.
I'm sure it did.
Provided they weren't hurling over the side. My dad would never want to go on a cruise. My mother always wanted to go on a cruise, and I think it's that Samaria. That was the troop ship that they went over on, and I don't think it was a big cruise. So, but he didn't want to go on a cruise. But I think that's what really helped, my dad and his buddies. They were able to decompress together.
And Don, you mentioned Vietnam. Those guys didn't get that. They flew home on what? Well, they flew home on commercial airliners.
And then they got spat at when they came through the airport. Welcome home.
Yeah,
it's gross.
Yeah. Fortunately enough, or unfortunately, or fortunately enough, we're recognizing that and looking at those guys now, and hopefully giving them the recognition that they deserve.
I can't remember who it was, but I think it was either at the end of Ambrose's book or another one. I can't remember who it was. Guy from Easy Company got sent home. Parents didn't pick him up. He had to hitchhike home. And I remember I was telling my dad this story. And the guy picked him up. Hey, I got to pull over and urinate. So they get out and they empty the water, and turns around. The guy's got a gun. Robbed him of everything. All his money he made playing poker coming back. All his bring home stuff. You know, guy roughly the same age. My dad's like, yeah, so much for the greatest generation, huh? It's like, yeah, a lot of them are great, but they're just like everybody else. There's you got a group of a-holes out there looking to take advantage. Here's a guy who just served his country, came home, and got robbed in the United States of all his bring homes, all his back pay, everything. And just goes.
I'm trying to think if that was Hashy. I don't know if that was Lester Hashy.
I can't.
I do remember that. Or was it Joe Lesneski?
It may have been.
Although Joe Lesneski, if it would have been a fist fight, Joe would have beat the crap out of the guy.
Yeah, I think he had a knife or a gun, but I'd have to go back and look. I remember the story, but I just can't remember who it happened to.
Yeah.
But it's just like another one that's hard, like your dad, Shifty Powers. You know, not that a gunny sack full of bring homes makes it all worth it, but you know, it might be a little nice to have, especially if you have the choice of whether you leave it or lose it. I'm sure most of the guys would like to have it. And just to get robbed of it. It's
at
like
least the spoils of war.
Yeah.
You know, spoils of war for sure.
Especially your back pay. As you know, most of that stuff went home for the family to help pay the bills and this and that, and come home and buy your own house, start your own life. So guy came back from serving, has all his back pay, all this money he won, and gone. Now you just gotta wait for the paperwork for the GI Bill to get pushed through.
Yeah.
Real quick before we move on, I do got to hit mail call because our listeners have been coming through with the emails lately. And if you guys want to email us, we'd love to hear from you. Mail us at mailcall@WTSPWorldWar2.com or mailcall@WTSPWWII.com. Don, Henry, and Jeff, just wanted to give you guys a shout out here and tell you how much I really enjoyed What's the Scuttlebutt and all the content you put on there. Let's see. Most of the time I've already fallen asleep when you guys are live, and they actually checked in tonight and said, hey, been looking forward to listening to the show tomorrow. Wanted to pop in and say hi before I passed out. But yeah, I said, I always fall asleep when you guys are live, but I always put a smile on my face when I wake up to see the push notification on YouTube that you guys were live. I always walk away from each episode either with new knowledge or a good laugh, or being lost in thought, reflecting on the topics you guys cover most of the times, all of the above. And thank you so much for the great email, and we love hearing from each and every one of you guys, so please keep that coming. And if you haven't done so, please head over to WTSPWorldWar2.com, click on the link, find us on YouTube so you can watch us stream live every Monday. And if you really want to help support what we do here, please click on that Patreon link. You can sign up and subscribe. It only costs you $1 a month. And get some t-shirts, and well, you could get hats, but they've all been taken down, but we'll see that story for next week. For some reason, the fine people at Teespring don't like the new logos. On shirts, fine. Sweaters, fine. For some reason, on hats, content concern. They say they take it down, but that's neither here nor there. I've already said earlier that I'm still slowly making my way through the rest of Longest Day, but Henry, what you reading?
Yes, so I finished Hang Tough.
Such a good book.
By our buddy Jared Frederick.
Have you read that yet, George?
I have not. I've heard it's great.
I did enjoy it a lot. What I'm reading now, just started a couple of days ago, is this book called Red Scorpion by Peter Saskin, and it is about a submarine in the Pacific. I'm really interested in this because Peter Saskin, who wrote this book, his dad was a machinist mate on the Rasher, the USS Rasher, that it's about. So, you know, Don, like we've talked about, I mean, with me working on the project I'm working on, a son bringing to life his dad's story using his dad's diary, that for procedural reasons, okay, for very esoteric reasons, I'm really interested in that. Kind of see how he does it.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm reading right now. Really enjoying it.
Hey, George, what you reading?
Well, actually, I just finished. I was on a cruise from South Africa to Rio, and I finished Cole Kingseed's book about winters.
What's the title of that one?
Beyond Band of Brothers?
I'm looking at I think I have that one. Yeah, I think I do have that one.
I've heard of it.
Yeah, Cole Kingseed.
I recognize that name as soon as you said it.
Yeah. Oh, here's kind of a funny story about Cole. So anyway, I get back from South America, just the tour from South Africa to South America. I get back and I don't get a chance to read many books for a myriad of reasons. However, I finished that book,
Mm-hmm.
and it was about 9:30 in the morning. He lives just right down the road in New York someplace.
Mm-hmm.
So I give him a call. Ring. Yeah, that's it right there. So I pick it up, and it's like,
okay, yeah.
So he picks up the phone and says, "Hello. Oh, Cole, it's George Laws. Oh, George, I'm in Hawaii." So I said, "Oh, gee whiz, it's 3:30 in the morning." I said, "Well, you didn't tell me you were in Hawaii." So I said, "All right." He says, "I'll call you later."
Yeah, call me back in 7 hours. I think this was probably the third or fourth. No, after Stephen Ambrose's, and actually, I had Beyond Band of Brothers, the Garnier and Heffron story before I actually had Ambrose's book. But I think after that, this is probably the next one I got. This is a great book.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. I got a lot of good content out of that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's a lot of good content out of that. Actually, I'm reading a book about Winston Churchill now. So, a friend of mine gave me a book on Winston Churchill. I've got 2 stacks of books.
Yeah.
I've got, the ones I've read and the ones I've got to read.
Yeah. Well, we pretty much all are. Did you guys see Darkest Hour, the Churchill movie a few years back?
Yeah.
That was really well done.
Well, actually, here's an interesting little side note is I represented Winston Churchill's great-grandson, Jonathan Sands. He had written a book called God and Churchill. And I kind of got a call. A friend of mine said, "Hey, Winston Churchill's great-grandson is going to give you a call. He's just coming out with a brand new book." And I told him, "You want to talk to George Laws?" I don't know why. But anyway, so I assisted him in getting him some speaking opportunities.
That's awesome.
And, but yeah, so that was kind of neat. And I was able to provide a little bit of opportunities for him and learn a little bit more about Winston Churchill, which was pretty cool.
Neat.
When the book came out, 92?
Yep.
Did you or your siblings or any of the children of the men of Easy Company, did you guys, I can't imagine you did, but could you guys foresee the impact it would have on all your families? I mean, could you imagine then that these many years later you would be attached to these tours and represent your father the way you are?
No, not at that point, because the book came out and it was well received, but it wasn't, there was a lot of great books out there about units in World War II. And, it wasn't until the, Hanks and Spielberg bought the rights to the 2 books there, Citizen Soldier and Band of Brothers. So, but yeah, it's just been an amazing ride for all of us to, to share these stories and to admire the sacrifices and moving forward to thank, Hanks and Spielberg for telling their story. And I think, and the actors did such an amazing job and continue to be great ambassadors. And I think what my dad probably would have taken away from it is that he had hoped that all the other men and women they could share their stories. And hopefully their sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters would ask them questions about their service. Because we all know whether you were training people from this side or pushing pencils across paper on the other side in Europe or in the Pacific or whatever it was, wherever you were, if you were kicking doors in or carrying stuff around, you did something, and it was an important part of each of the effort. And I think that's what he would have hoped for.
And I think those are great words to go out on. So thank each and every one of you for your continued support of our podcast. For myself, Jeff Copsetta, who couldn't be here tonight, Henry Sledge, and George Luz Jr., we want to thank each and every one of you, and we will talk to you all this time next week.
This has been a Digital 410 production.